I want to take just a few minutes to introduce the idea of maps and mapping. We'll use those ideas as a thread to lead us through this course. In simplest terms, a map is just a picture that shows some kind of relationships. We mostly think of maps in terms of geography, locations, directions, and distances. But there are all sorts of maps, such as maps of the brain, or even maps of concepts. So, for example, we can think of a map of time, or a timeline. That shows the way from the past to the present and maybe even into the future. We can use a map to help us know how to get from one point, whether that's a place or time, to another. A map can help us recognize places along the way, and it can help us prepare for obstacles we may find along the way, whether that's a mountain we have to climb or an exam we have to pass. Maps also do other things. For example, when we look at a map of the world, we automatically put ourselves someplace on it. We think of where we belong, where we were born, or where our family is, or whatever might give us a special sense of value. When we look at the lines on a map that separate political divisions, like nations, we automatically draw a distinction between ourselves, the people who are inside a set of lines, and others who are outside those lines. Many times the maps and the boundaries we draw aren't geographical and political. For example, people have long drawn mental maps based on race or religion. So I see those people who look and talk and act like me as inside and others as outside some imaginary boundary. The maps we draw often tell us a lot about the people who draw them. For example, if you look at a map of the world from a different time and place, you're likely to find it looking very different from the map we'd expect to see today. In the course materials for week 1 are several maps from different places and times. For example, there's one of the earliest known maps which comes from ancient Mesopotamia and is made on a clay tablet. It's very hard for us to recognize as a map at all. However, it shows how people of that time and place several thousand years ago saw the relationships between their land, the rest of the world, and the heavens. One that's much easier to recognize is a drawing from Egypt that shows a similar set of relationships between the earth and the heavens, with the heavens represented as a mother goddess who gave birth to the world every day in the form of the sun. Still other maps are from later times. For example, there's a Roman map that shows roads throughout the Roman Empire. If you look at that map in detail, one thing that should strike you is that it doesn't show directional relationships and scale, as we'd expect to see on a map today. All it shows is the relative positions of towns and the distances between them. We can see this better in a small piece of the map showing the city of Constantinople, which was then the capital of the empire, and adjacent areas. The whole thing is very much flattened from north to south. We can get a better feel for how flattened the map is by comparing it to a modern map showing the extent of the Roman Empire on a modern map. An Arabic map seems very odd to us because south is toward the top of the map, whereas we're used to thinking of up as north. Other maps from still later are interesting because they show an awareness that people's knowledge of the world was limited, that there were parts of the world that people knew must exist, but about which they had no details. One way of representing that was to draw clouds that covered those areas. Pretty clever in my mind. Perhaps most interesting and revealing about people's ways of thinking and seeing themselves are a couple of maps. One is a Chinese map of the world made for the Emperor of China. That shows China in the center of the map, which made all the sense in the world if you were the Chinese emperor. He knew that his country was among the biggest, richest, and most sophisticated on earth. In fact, he didn't think anyone else was China's equal. So it was completely natural to put China in the middle. Another map of the world, made several hundred years later, puts Great Britain at the center. That change reflects a couple of things that happened between the time of the Chinese map and the later one. First was that technology had changed in a way that trade tied almost the whole world together, and sailors needed a common set of maps that were accurate and reliable to carry on that trade safely and profitably. Second was that the British had established themselves as the dominant seafaring nation, so the British government had a special interest in creating accurate, reliable maps of the world for navigation. Another reason for this was that because the British led in these areas, just about every other nation's sailors used the British maps. As a result, eventually all nations agreed to a common way of defining relationships. One part of that agreement was to put 0 degrees of longitude, the north-south lines on a map, going through Greenwich, England, which is where Britain's Royal Observatory was. Finally, by the time these decisions had been made, Britain had become the biggest and about the most powerful empire in the world, a lot like the Romans had been at the time the Roman map we have was made. So putting the British Isles in the middle of the map made sense in terms of national prestige as well as for practical purposes of navigation. One last map to look at is actually a joke, but it makes an important point about maps and the way we see the world around us. That's a map of the United States as seen by a New Yorker. The map shows a big distance from 9th to 10th Avenue, and about the same distance to the Hudson River. The distance from the Hudson River to the Pacific Ocean is about the same as from 9th to 10th Avenue. Of course, everyone knows that's not the way the continent really is. However, it's a good representation of a basic fact about the way we really do see the world in our minds. Whatever is part of, or most important, or closest to us in some ways, is a lot bigger than everything else. So our mental maps of the world are usually very different from the relationships that exist outside our heads and hearts. This tendency to distort the picture we have of the world is extremely important in terms of how we think and act. For example, most of us are completely unaware of what's happening in Central Africa today. If there's not some kind of crisis that makes the news, however we happen to get our news, Central Africa and the people who are in it just aren't on our map. For all practical purposes, they don't exist. That part of the world is as unknown to us as the parts covered by clouds on the map from the 1600s. The same is true for different kinds of events. For example, I haven't got the slightest clue what's happening in popular music today. The current generation of performers isn't on my mental map. The point I want to make and use as a starting point for the rest of the course is just this. Maps are a way of imagining the world, and mapping, the process of creating that image of things and relationships in our minds, is something we do naturally and constantly. Those images we create in large measure determine how we think and act. So what I ask you to do from now through the end of the course is to start paying attention to the fact that you're constantly making maps, to think about what and how you make those maps, as well as how people have made maps and used maps in the past. And think about how those maps determine what you are, do, and lead to happening. If you start doing that, this course should be a lot more interesting, and you'll surely gain a knowledge about yourself and the world that will be extremely valuable in the long run.